a great day, I'm feeling good. Oh, the possibilities of what I could.
What happens when a blind man, a woman of color, and a child of immigrants get together to discuss how diversity, inclusion, and equity affect your business?
I'm moving fast. Oh, I'm optimistic.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Choose Inclusion podcast. I'm UB, and I am the Latino white guy of the group.
I'm Nina. I am the woman of color in the group.
And I'm Mike. I'm the blind guy.
Oh, well, I mean, it didn't have so much impact on the work on Section 508 and digital accessibility because Section 508 is kind of it's a really unique law in the way in which it changes society. Laws like the Rehabilitation Act in 1973, which was really the first major legislation that for people with disabilities had historical precedence from other civil rights laws. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which is probably the biggest opportunity for people with disabilities because it went beyond just the federal government and federal grantees. Now it was all of a sudden all of society. That really owes its basic structure to the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Just in the way, for instance, one of the things that I complain about is that in web accessibility, we've got this divide between how you cover private businesses. And it all comes down to this language, place of public accommodation. That term, public accommodation, originally came from the Civil Rights Act of 64. And so there's this historical precedent that comes along with that, and it's in a good way and sometimes in a bad way. And one of the bad ways is that it limited our ability to get to private businesses sometimes. And that's a whole other legal presentation. But basically what it comes down to is you can sue, say, Netflix, for instance, in Massachusetts successfully, but you can't sue them in California successfully under the ADA. And it all comes down to the way in which courts interpret that term public accommodation, and that's a leftover from the 64 Civil Rights Act. And there are little nuances like that. These laws all have some basis in these older laws, and so the interpretations of how courts have interpreted those older laws bleeds into how we interpret some of the newer laws.
Do you find that, I guess in comparing when these laws first came out to now, is there a difference in how companies essentially how they reacted to those laws? So, were some looking for shortcuts and, ways to manage or be in compliance before, whereas now they're taking it more seriously? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, so for instance, when web accessibility, that's a big one, right? Websites weren't around really back in 1990. And so a lot of people say, well, you can't sue us because of our website, or if I'm an online only company, you can't sue me under this old law that's intended to cover gas stations and drugstores. I'm not like a traditional company. I'm a purely online company. And so, if you wanted law that covers those kinds of companies, well, you're perfectly within your rights to try and tell Congress to rewrite the ADA, and good luck with that. So, yeah, trying to take these old laws and morph them into something that can be used in modern society is sometimes really hard. But what amazes me is actually how well we do with these things. I mean, this issue isn't unique to this idea of applying old laws to new problems isn't unique to just web accessibility and digital accessibility. It's constant in the American legal system, and you have to somehow do it.
Well, Ken, one of the other, because again, the Choose Inclusion, we're always focused on the lens of how to
from a best practices perspective, how do you create, organizations, 'cause we know some of the data that supports, organizations that are truly, that embrace inclusion on multiple fronts. They literally outperform. They outperform in a for-profit way their peers in in the same vertical. And so from the accessibility lens. You've heard me say this to you and Jeffrey when we had, I think it was probably the last conference that was safe to go to, the PAC Rim in early March of 2020. We got to hang out a little bit, and I'm always talking about, well, so from the Title III, the ADA Title III perspective, that's what a lot of public-facing companies are getting dinged on, making sure that if you've got a website that's public, that public accommodation, you got to make sure that that part is accessible. But I submit that those same technologies, those same best practices to make that same digital content externally facing accessible, when you apply those same methodologies, those same technologies to your internal landscape from an employment perspective, you get more bang for your buck, and now you're actually able to be more inclusive from an employment perspective with the people with disabilities who still have an egregious unemployment epidemic. Love to get your lens on that.
Yeah. Oh, I absolutely agree with you. You're preaching to the choir there. We've got a huge problem in our country with the employment levels for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. And even before COVID came along, it's shocking to me. And that when you take those technologies that we've been applying towards the outside, and apply them towards intranets and towards, in-house systems, then it really does improve opportunities for the employees. But where the problem sometimes comes up, though, that I see is that a lot of the internal systems aren't systems that are built by that company, whereas their external-facing websites are. And so they have more control over the accessibility of their main e-commerce website, for instance, but their internal website is very often something that they bought off the shelf and that they tweaked a little bit. So, I'm thinking about like all these HR systems, like I'm doing right now, my annual employee performance review, and I have to do it through this web-based interface. And I won't tell you what the product is, but it's something that our company bought that's, off the shelf. And I think that's more where 508 comes in, because 508 is a law that really requires the federal government, when they're buying that same product, to make sure that they think about accessibility and push that higher and higher, because, that best meets requirement that I talked about earlier. And that the thought was that when that company makes their product accessible in order to meet the federal government's requirements, that they wouldn't just make just for the federal government, that they'd make it for everyone else too. But yeah, I mean, one doesn't necessarily drive the other, even though logic would say it should, just because of that difference. So the internal systems are very often bought, and then they have to go back to their vendor and say, like, why didn't you make the system better, as opposed to just their own developers saying, where they could just say, fix it.
No, I totally agree. And a lot of times, the suggestions that we Blind Institute of Technology give employers is, starting with a procurement policy, right? Making sure that the internal systems, so it starts, we always say from policy to placement, and making sure that organizations from a strategy level roadmap, they have to include procurement policies, making sure that those vendors are giving them accessible technology, and that's quite a different set of conversations with organizations. But again, it's a broader conversation. But I just appreciate your lens with that.
Hey, Ken, sorry, I was going to ask, what are you excited about? Just to kind of close this particular conversation, because Mike's right. I mean, we could talk about this forever, but what are you, since you've sort of been there from the beginning, let's say, what are you excited about? What's on the horizon? Like, I don't know what's the future look like, even in coming out of COVID-19.
Oh, I think the things that I'm excited about are, yeah, they're definitely technological. Like, for instance, EdgeGuide. I think that that's amazing technology, especially when we combine that with augmented reality. Because eventually what I can see happening is that we start creating digital maps of the world around us. And if I could know, for instance, at a particular, well, not necessarily GPS location, but a location that we can track to a much finer degree than GPS would allow. If I knew that at a particular location is a door to a store, for instance, then it just opens up amazing opportunities to people with disabilities, assuming that we can create some sort of open standard that we can all be developing to. So if I'm running a grocery store, if I have a grocery store and I implement a set of beacons around my grocery store, that I can create a system so that I can tell where the front door is and where the cashiers are and where the different departments within the grocery store are, without having to worry about it being confined to one particular system. That it was open so that anybody who came along who happened to have a smartphone would be able to navigate internally within my store. So interior wayfinding is something I've been super excited about for the last 6 years or so, I'd say 7 years, when I first started seeing it coming around. That's probably the biggest one right now. Although, I get I'm one of those people who gets excited by little baubles, little shiny objects, right?
For sure.
And so that's been a shiny object that's been on the horizon. It's been taunting me for years. But yeah, there are a lot of other little things that come along that just, capture my attention and say, "Oh my God, that's the greatest thing ever."
Well, and I'm with you, and I get excited about EdgeGuide as well, because Mike always talks about giving everyone the opportunity to participate in this modern world. I mean, again, the technology is there; it's been there, but it's now on us to apply it in better ways, so that every single person can enjoy the dignity and the freedoms of experiencing the world as it is. And so I completely agree. Like, it's such an exciting technology, but an exciting future that, going back to what Mike said earlier too, like, it's something that can, I think, help and be impactful on everybody, not just people with disabilities.
Exactly. I cannot wait for this technology to be commonplace. Just because as I walk around the world, I want to be able to just go to the thing, identify something internally inside a mall, for instance, or, I want to be able to meet somebody within a subway station, and I want to know exactly where it is, and I'd just be guided there, just like I'm driving down the street in the car. I got to believe that the rest of the world would just seize on it and just jump all over it, just because it's such an exciting opportunity.
No pressure, Mike.
I totally agree. I'm excited for EdgeGuide to continue to build out, and that's actually, ladies and gentlemen listening, how I got to meet Mr. Ken Nakata with one of the contracts that you get to do as a consultant. You get consulted out by small agencies like NASA to go out and look at the museum spaces and other learning type spaces for accessible technology. Do you want to just real quick talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to, because it's one of those. It gets back to Crip Camp, actually. that one of the laws that the law that they were really trying to struggle hard in the beginning to push forward, Judy Heumann and all the others, was Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is the law that requires federal agencies and federal grantees to not discriminate against people with disabilities. Now, when we look out into the real world and looking outside my window, the federal government impacts so many of the things that I can just see just by looking out my window. Like I look at the street corner and I know that, the Department of Transportation probably has helped fund the city of Seattle at some point to put up that street light or to come up with the regulations on what that curb ramp looks like at the street corner. Or, there's a blue mailbox out at the corner and that's federal post office. And the federal government has so much, has so many it affects so many people's lives in ways that we hardly even notice until you live inside Washington D.C. and you talk to the federal agencies and they tell you how far their reach really goes. You don't really sense that as a citizen. And so if we took 504 really seriously, it would have changed the world in such a broad way that the Americans with Disabilities Act would have just been just a little bit of icing on the cake. Instead, the Americans with Disabilities Act is like the monumental law of civil rights because people weren't taking 504 very seriously. One of the agencies that does take 504 very seriously is NASA, National Aeronautic and Space Administration. And so they require all their grantees to prove that they're in compliance with Section 504. And so they do yearly audits and then they do compliance reviews, which are very in-depth reviews of those facilities. So every year, my team goes to one of the facilities that they select and we conduct several days of interviews and we look over their website and look at all their information technology and we do a full architectural review of all their public spaces. So it combines both digital and built environment accessibility. And we come up with this mammoth report and we said, here are all the things you're doing right, and here are all the things you're doing wrong, here are your promising practices, here are the points that you have to boost compliance. And we've been doing that for, about 12 years now. And it's really exciting. I wish that if other agencies did what NASA did, we would be having a very different conversation right now.
Well, and hopefully,
that.
yeah, it's so appreciated what you all are doing. And I think, now is a really interesting time that we find ourselves in that can hopefully, open the eyes and minds of other agencies to start to consider like what it will take to get everybody connected, right? And give everybody the chance to access anything or anywhere in the world, because right now we can't. And so it's it's such a cool thing you guys are doing, Ken. I think one quick thing that our listeners want to know from you is, what is your favorite wine?
I really am
Ken?
a fan of French Pinot Noir. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So after spending a couple of amazing days with Ken in Hawaii, I definitely have to say it definitely depends on the meal too, depending on your wine preference, correct?
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
Oh, now we're getting into wine snob territory here. Here we go.
Yeah. You can't have a French Burgundy if you're eating Asian food.
Right.
Yeah.
But a French Pinot Noir, that's your number one go-to.
Yeah, I'm a Burgundy person. Yeah.
Love it. What's your Tuesday drinking wine?
My Tuesday drinking wine. Just a basic, actually it's a Burgundy. What I'm drinking right now is, a Bourgogne. So that's just a basic, just a basic red Pinot Noir from, a producer named Parent, Parent. And Anne Parent is I guess the current owner, head of that company, but it traces its roots all the way back to I think the 16th century. And Thomas Jefferson used to drink a Parent Burgundy, but of course a higher end one than the one I'm drinking.
No, that sounds wonderful. Well, Ken, it's been a pleasure, and thank you so much. This is such an amazing conversation.
Thank you, Ken.
Well, thanks. Yeah, my pleasure.
Thanks, Ken, for coming on. Really appreciate it, buddy.
Yep, anytime.
All right, we are out. Choose Inclusion fans, we will talk to you again soon. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks.
See you guys.
Thanks for listening to the Choose Inclusion podcast. Make sure to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And you can see closed captioning for this podcast on our YouTube channel. You can find us online on our website, chooseinclusion.com, and contact us on Twitter @chooseinclusion.